Hi, everyone. It's Jessica Keener, and I am here to talk with you all today about CSS fundamentals. I think the add on there was something along the lines of like for CSS novices and haters, which I imagine is pretty accurate. So as I go through this, we're going to start at 0 so that we all have the same vernacular and general understanding. So for those of you that know a little bit about CSS, it may seem really basic, but then we're going to move really quickly into the 60-mile-an-hour zone. So just hold on. I promise there's something in here for everyone. And if you have questions, just go ahead and add them into the chat. And I have been told that I will get to see them as you write them. So let me go ahead and make myself just a little smaller and just a little dimmer. And I apologize for my camera situation. It's been kind of weird this morning. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessica. It used to be Kennedy, now it's Keener. I'm a senior software engineer. I've been doing UI and UX for many, many years, especially in the e-commerce and mobile sectors. And right now I'm working for a polyglot org and have been doing that for a long time. Like I said, I was recently remarried, so you might have known me as Kennedy, but now it's Keener. And here are some of my favorite things, because you got to add an obligatory something about your personal life. So I'm going to go over what we're going to cover in this session real quick so that we have clear expectations on that. First, just basic syntax and definitions, like I was just saying. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the cascade part of CSS. Then we're going to get into semantics. Talk just briefly about some methodologies, or at least some of the most important ones to kind of keep you out of CSS hell. Preprocessors we're going to touch on for just a moment. And then last but not least, we're just going to list a few things that you can Google if you're interested. So let's go ahead and get started with the syntax and definitions. So I imagine that most of you know what CSS stands for, but just in case you don't, it stands for Cascading Style Sheet. And CSS is, something's going on. Okay. So this is generally just talking about how your HTML markup is going to look when it's rendered on the page. CSS is made up of rules, and those rules are just talking about how the CSS applies styles to each HTML element. So like in this case, the CSS selector over on this side of my selector is saying to make the color of this text green, and so it will be green. Pretty basic, straightforward. Now each rule has different portions of it that we're going to talk about, and I'll do my best to get correct as we go through. Firstly, there's the selector. Then inside of the selector, we have declarations, which are what is this entire little section here underlined in pink. And a declaration contains a property and a value for that property, just like if you were doing a variable and setting the variable. So one of the first things that confuses CSS noobs is this idea of a box model. Most elements, and I'm not saying all of them, I know there's some exceptions to this, are going to either be a block level element or an inline element. And that's an important distinction to make if you've never seen them before, because block level elements you can do whatever you want to with, but inline elements are a little more limited in what you can do to style them. So kind of think of inline elements as something that you would put inside of a paragraph. You wouldn't want to have something styled wildly if it was inside of a paragraph, because it would look really weird. So some great examples of inline elements that are just kind of inline out of the box are spans, bold, italic, tags, things like that. If you've not seen it before, this is a view of a block model for an element. And it kind of shows you what each piece of a block model is stylable. So you can see like at the outer portion here, we've got like a margin that's on the outside. And then you've got a border the padding, and then the element itself. If you've not seen this, I'm actually going to show you what that looks like here real quick. This is just a very quick pro tip on how to look at the block model and how to do a couple of really basic things when you're looking at CSS and inspecting it, for those of you who have not used it before. So we can see we've got this block model here. We're going to go and inspect it. All right, so if you've never seen this panel before, on this side, you're going to see your HTML elements. I just inspected this one, which says that it's a block example. And you can see here is the CSS that's attached to this particular block example, giving it a background color and a border. All right. So because this is a block, I can do things like add padding to it and say that it's 10 pixels. And if you watch over here, you can see that it added 10 pixels of padding. And very conveniently, it also tells you like, hey, you can see this padding here and that it's been added. You can do the same thing for margin. So I'm going to make this 50 pixels because it's a little easier to see. So the margin here is the invisible part around the outside. We can see that really easily here. Now, the other really cool thing about looking in this inspector, and this is at least in Chrome, they all do it, but there's a couple of places that it actually shows you your block model in real life. So if you scroll down to the bottom, you can see this block model and it will highlight each of these pieces for you to make it really easy to see. You can do the same thing if you go to Computed. Computed shows you a list of the specific styles that are actually applied to it and where they come from. This isn't a very complex example, so they're all pretty obvious, but those are the two places you can look for it. Just as a little quick pro tip, if you're trying to adjust the margin or the padding or literally anything with numbers, you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard and go up and down, and you can actually watch it move. And if you want to do it by points, you can hold down Option and press your arrow keys. You can also do it by 100s by pressing down Command, or you can press Shift and it'll go by 10s. So those are just some like really fun little extra things you can do if you wanted to. It just makes your life a lot easier when you're trying to figure out exactly the padding or margin. Now, I'm also going to show real quick here what happens if I turn this into a, actually, let me make this padding a little bit smaller so you can see it better. So let's bump this down to like 10 pixels and the margin down to 10. Ooh, this is interesting. I've not seen that before. So if we turn this now into a inline element, you can see all of a sudden some of the margin and padding that we had before disappears. This is part of what I was talking about for how you can't always style stuff exactly as you would like for inline. You can also see there's some other options here that actually make that easier, but I just wanted to throw it out there. That is one of the ways that things can get a little weird. Anyway, let's go back to our crash course here. So now we're going to talk a little bit about selectors. And this is simply how CSS knows what elements to apply rules to. There are three basic types. First, you've got element selectors, which is literally just the HTML element. So in this case, it's an H1. And the selector over here is also an H1. And it's just saying that any H1 element that exists is going to be green. Pretty straightforward. The second one is a class selector. This selects any elements that have a particular class, delineated by literally the word class. And any of those, it's going to then color green. The nice thing about classes, you can actually have more than one of these separated by spaces, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. And then last but not least, you have ID selectors, which, as you may have guessed at this point, anything with an ID that matches is going to be colored green. Now, IDs you should only have one of on a page if you're doing correct HTML markup. So they're very specific, and these are delineated by the pound or hashtag or whatever you want to call it symbol. I think I forgot to say elements are delineated by the dot. So this is pretty straightforward on the surface, but we can compound selectors. And this is what I was talking about with classes. And it's a really powerful part of CSS. So in this case, we have two classes, a class of headline, then there's a space, and a class of fancy. So we can now compound these, and you can see that like in this first one, div.headline, meaning a div class, and then you can see there is no space in between the dot headline and the div, means any div that has a class of headline is going to be colored in this green color. Or you could also say anything with dot headline dot fancy. Again, see there's no space here. That's the same thing. So both of these are going to be colored the same. Oh, I see I've got a new question here. Okay. So we had a question about the block model. I'll address that in a few minutes if I can be reminded, because we're going to be opening up and looking at an example again in a minute. So that's a really good question. So someone reminds me when we get to the next example. I think that's a really good question, actually. All right. So anyway, I'm going to keep moving on here, but essentially what we're talking about here with selectors and compounding is if there's not a space between the selectors, then it's talking about the same element. Whereas, well, is it gonna go? Come on, little fella. If we're talking about having parent-child selectors, there's going to be a space there. So in this example, we have a div with a class of headline, and then there's some H1s and divs in it. Now, if we look over at our CSS selector, the first thing we see is dot headline. So we know dot means class, but then there's a space after the headline that's saying anything inside of headline is going to be colored green if it's an H1. So we're looking at any class of headline, and then inside of it, all of the H1 tags. So this H1 and this one, both of them are going to be styled green. Okay. So this starts out and it's easy, right? So it starts off easy, but then there's some issues like this. So in this case, we can see we've got two CSS selectors that are both H1s, and one says red and one says green. So what about this one? We've got an H1 that says red, and then we've got an ID of header that says orange, and we've got a class that says blue. So what color is it going to be? What about now? Unfortunately, I can't see your answers because usually I'm asking live, but I'll assume that people are staring and trying to figure it out. So all three of these also relate exactly to this and could all tell this what color it's going to be. So how do we figure out what that color is? I'm not actually expecting you to know that just yet. That's what we're going to talk about here in just a second. That is where the cascade part of cascading style sheets enters. So we have to be able to know which styles take precedence, and that's really what the cascade is talking about. And when I say that, I mean, the basics of it are there are two or three ways that this can happen. First is order. So the styles that are loaded later are going to override those that are loaded earlier. This one's a simple one. You can think of it very similar to a variable that's been set earlier in your code. If you override it later, the variable is going to change. So that one is at least relatively straightforward for programmers. So here's an example of that. All three of these elements here are part of a style sheet, but this first H1 says green is the color. The second one says orange is the color. So because this one literally comes later, the color here is going to be overridden to orange. Now, as note, this is also only taking into effect color green and I don't know, border of 1 pixel in red. it would still have a 1 pixel red border and the color would then be orange. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. The second part of the cascade and understanding that is specificity. And this is really saying that like the more specific a style rule is, the more that we care about it. That sounds easy on the surface, right? No, it is not easy, I promise. This is the thing that most people get stuck on, even people that have done CSS for years, and it is often the reason that people hate CSS. But we're going to talk about it. We're going to get through it. It's going to be just fine. And in order to do this, we're going to use a methodology that I did not come up with, but I like a lot. It's called the Star Wars CSS. And it gives Star Wars characters a, they're each assigned to a different type of selector. And we can use those to understand better how specificity works in CSS. So the first selector is element selectors, and they are the lowly stormtrooper that are terrible. So any selector that has a single element in it has an element selector specificity of 1. In this case, we have a selector that has 3 items in it: body, section, and H1. So inside of the body, any section, and then inside of that section, any H1 are going to have this these rules applied to it. And it also has a specificity of 3 because there are 3 elements in this selector. All right. Stormtroopers are lame though. They can easily be overridden by the Darth Vaders or the classes. Any class selector takes precedence over elements when you're talking about specificity. So in this case, we're looking for any element that has both a headline and a content class, and then inside of that, a primary class, and inside of that, a foo class. Doesn't really matter though, because as long as it has 4 classes in that rule, it has a class specificity of 4, or a Darth Vader of 4. And there are no elements in here, so there's an element specificity of 0. And then last but not least, we have the Emperor ID selectors, which, and I did not come up with this, but apparently emperors are much better than Darth Vader. So the ID selectors in here have the most specificity, which makes sense logically. You should only have 1 ID selector on a page. So if you are styling something with an ID on it, it's probably pretty likely you really, really want it to be that style. In this case, we have an ID selector or emperor selector specificity of 2. If you're writing CSS like this, probably that's real bad though. So we'll talk about why in a little bit, but for example's sake, that's what we have for IDs. So here's an example that combines all of these so we can see the specificity here. All right. So first we need to see how many elements we have. In this case, we have 1 body element, and way over there is 1 H1 element. So the specificity for elements is 2. Then we have 2 classes of dot container, and then further over, I can't quite reach, dot headline. So there's a class selector of 2. And then for IDs, we just have 1 ID, which is main. So this rule, or this set of rules, has got all of this set as its specificity. All right. Here's another example. In this example, we have 12 elements, no classes or no IDs. So in this example, the previous one would be a lot more specific than this one, because if there's even 1 class element, it's always going to override all of the elements that are just plain old elements without classes or IDs. All right, so we're going to try this, and I do want you to try and answer, but the question here is, which one of these 2 is more specific, A or B? I'm assuming everyone is answering, and they're probably saying it's B. I don't know because I haven't gotten anything back, but I'm assuming that y'all are hopefully looking at this and saying that it's B, because even though this has a ton of elements in it, it has 1 class in it. Classes always override elements. All right, cool. People voting for B. Nice. So B is going to be the more specific of the two, regardless of its order in this style sheet. So what about this one? All right, it's probably A. If you said A, yay, okay, cool. I just got confirmation that everyone voted A, hooray. So same situation as before, because there is one ID in A. Doesn't really matter what's in B if there's no IDs, because IDs always override the classes or the elements. Last but not least, and this is the tricky one. And this is why specificity can be kind of challenging also. All right, well, the answer is A, very good. So I'm assuming because we just saw that, or because y'all are saying A, that you figured it out, but we have the same number of ID in classes, regardless of what they are. This could be any class, by the way. It doesn't have to be the exact same one, or any ID, as long as they are IDs or classes. But A has 2 elements where B only has 1, therefore it's more specific. Good job, guys. So let's talk a little bit about the nuclear options that I suspect probably everyone in here has used at least once out of sheer frustration. Styles on elements. This is something that is always going to take precedence over any level of specificity, because if you're literally writing a style on that element, then you definitely want that element to be that style. So this is going to be purple no matter how much you put in your style sheet. And again, we want to use this very sparingly. There are times that you'd want to use it. I pretty regularly get the question, but when are those times? The times I've ever used inline styles, it's been because of essentially like some kind of configuration that like a user sets, or something coming from a database that's like very hard to predict. So you might want to literally style something onto the element, like, I don't know, their image, or if they have like some special color, things like that. The thing I'm using for this presentation is called It's a pretty cool software and I love it. Anyway, that's probably the main reasons that you would want to use inline styles. I'm sure there are other applications, but for the most part, if you can avoid it, you want to do so, because long-term it's going to cause you some problems with maintenance. This is a great way to have really hard to maintain CSS. Important tags, also the thing that everybody uses when they're like, I can't figure it out, I'll just slap an important on it. Important tags are even more nuclear than putting something in line. So this H1 actually will be orange because there's an important on it. This is typically the thing people use when they don't understand what to do with CSS specificity. So I see this a lot where, like, you know, for some reason they can't figure out how to make the headline actually be orange because there's something overriding it later on. So they just slap an important on it. Almost always it can be fixed with being more specific. And if it can't, then that's real scary. Pretty much the only time I ever use important is if there is some kind of third-party library that I have no control over. Otherwise, again, you're going to get into a lot of problems with long-term maintenance. How are we doing for time? Oh, pretty good. Is it just okay to use IDs without a class? Just working with IDs in CSS? It's a terrible idea to do that. I will talk about why in a few minutes. But essentially the reason is because, oh, sounds like somebody just asked about important too. Hopefully I just covered that. Anyway, just saw the question about IDs. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in methodologies. But essentially the reason you wouldn't want to do that is because you're going to get a lot of duplicate CSS. There are plenty of times when you want to have something styled more than one time ever on your page, and you can't really do that with IDs. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So we're going to talk about semantics, and the semantics here is really just talking about naming stuff. I know there's a lot of opinions and hot takes on this, so this is my opinion and what has worked well for me, a person who has written a lot of design systems. So take that with a grain of salt. And I'm sure somebody here is going to ask about Tailwind at the end of this, so I'll cover that when we get to it. So as just a little starter exercise here, what would you label this bad boy if it was sitting in your house full of these toys? Like in real life, not in like a scenario where you're marking it up on a website. If you were trying to be helpful to yourself, would you name it something like big or box or white or 40 inches, God forbid? No, you'd probably label it toys, because what is inside of this box is toys. So labeling something by what it looks like is a real bad way to go. It's not scalable, okay? Ooh, somebody's getting into some BIM, I see in here. Cool, 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 cool. We're going to talk about that in a minute. I like it. So, that's kind of the basic premise of good semantics. And it's a good way to think about it if you're getting into semantic naming for the first time. Think about what is contained inside of there and not what something literally looks like. Oh, cool, toy box. That's good. So if you were looking at this, oh, sorry, I'm backwards here. If you were looking at this and you needed to mark it up for a website, what are some things that you could name it? And this is not a trick question. All right. So if you answered anything along the lines of quote or block quote, something like that, any of those would be fine. Oh no, a generated UID and then cry. No, we don't want to do that. So here is one great example that I pulled in real life from an actual production website at one of the companies that I have worked for recently. This is why we don't want to name things based on what they look like. We want to name them based on what's inside of them. And like, here's the first great example. %20 width 25%. Or I think there's another really good winner down here. Height 40 pixels, height 55 pixels. So what has happened here is someone started off making this. They got the site kind of big because they were, you know, working on a style sheet that had this. And then some designer or some product manager somewhere was like, that looks a little bit too close to me. Could we just increase that size? And rather than going back and updating the styles so that, or rather than updating like both the HTML and the CSS, they just updated the CSS. And I'm sure it looks fine, but like this is like a nightmare fuel situation. Whereas if it had just been labeled like, you know, quote or I don't know, order history, then it wouldn't have made any difference at all. They could play with it all they wanted to make it right. And nobody would semantically be looking at that and going, what? Why is it like this? I don't understand. And this is a very reasonable, I mean, like this happens all the time, like not trying to throw stones here. It's like a logical progression for people that have started with CSS. They want to name it based on like sizing and stuff like that, and then kind of work back from there. But as you build sites, that can get very frustrating for this exact reason. At the end of the day, just name the thing what it is and not what it looks like. And again, I know a lot of people love Tailwind. I'm not one of them. I hate it with the burning passion of 1,000 suns for this exact reason. But again, if it works for you, you don't have like a lot of people working on it, whatever, just do what makes you feel good inside. But I do not like Tailwind because it is the opposite of this. And there are some pluses to it. I know it's going to cut back on like the size of your CSS files. So if that's like super important to you, and it's kind of hard for me to imagine it is this day and age, then that might be something to look at. If it just works for your brain, do what works for you. But if you are trying to work with a design system and make something that's long-term maintainable, it's most likely that you're not going to want to do something like that. All right, so let's move on to CSS methodologies. To talk about this a little bit more, and I think some people have been hinting at this a little bit, we want to first kind of identify some of the problems that CSS traditionally has. Specificity issues are way up high. Anybody that's messed with CSS knows about these. It's a joke, it's a meme, we all get it. Oftentimes it's very hard to locate styles, especially if styles are disorganized or all over the place. It's really hard to do. There's a lot of bad context around styles. And what I mean by that is like, let's say you have a style called danger. Like it's a class that you put on anything that has danger. Well, let's say you have a designer that says, okay, well, these danger labels, these like little, I don't know, pop-ups for danger, they're too small. I want to increase the font size by 4 pixels and add some padding to it. You don't know what's going to break if you change that, because danger could also be used on buttons, it could be used on divs, it could be used in like 20 different contexts. So it's real scary to update that. It's much safer to just create a whole new class and start from scratch there, which is really frustrating, and it makes your style sheets huge. And then right along with that, it's very hard to have any consistency as a result. So this is what we're going to try and solve here. And this is where we're getting into the 60-mile-an-hour zone. So the methodology kind of at the top of what we're going to talk about here is called ITCSS. Stands for Inverted Triangle CSS. I didn't come up with this. This is a Harry Roberts thing from CSS Wizardry. The idea here is that whenever you're writing your CSS, or at least once it's compiled, should be a better way to put it now, as many preprocessors are out there, there is an idea that you want to have your styles written from very non-specific at the start, very broad, like a triangle, and then those get to very specific towards the bottom, right? So at the very bottom of that, you're going to have like your IDs or weird overrides or something like that. So again, starting broad, going to specific, like an inverted triangle. Just kind of as an illustration, if you were looking at a style sheet from a normal site, the specificity that flows through that style sheet from beginning to end may look something like this, where, you know, maybe you have some really vague stuff at the top, and then there's some specific stuff, and then not very specific, and then really specific, and kind of goes all over the place. Whereas what he is suggesting, and what we're going to talk about, is to make your styles go from very broad and then getting increasingly more specific as we go. Okay? I'm not sure if I need to pay attention to what's in the chat here for a second. Give me just 1 second. Oh, okay. So to do this, we're going to talk about how to structure our CSS at a high level, which, you know, is like, it works in theory, but until you understand how to do that, it's a little trickier. So to start, you're always going to want to start with your vague element styles, if you have any. So like general button classes, or what your inputs look like, really basic stuff like that. Vertical rhythm selectors probably is a little too high level, shouldn't have added that in, that's okay. Then there's going to be all of your general classes, which should make up 80+% of your code. Then we're going to get into overrides on specific styles. And And last but not least are the media query overrides. I think somebody asked about media queries up a little higher. I might have to go back and look at it real quick, but essentially these are just going to be any overrides for, like, I don't know, if you have like large breakpoints on your site that you want to handle. To accomplish all of this, we're going to use one of my favorite methodologies, which is BEM, which stands for Block Element Modifier. And it solves a heckin' lot of problems very quickly right out of the box. So we're going to talk through what BEM is and how to use it properly. And if you get comfortable with using this, it makes like 80% of CSS problems just vanish. It's wonderful. I've been teaching this to my interns for several years, and they consistently say they're very, very glad that we taught that instead of anything else. That's their favorite thing. Sorry, throat's doing a scratch there. All right, so BEM is a way of writing classes that consist of, I almost think of it as like writing variables that have been normalized so that they're just like one long string. So at the start, you're going to have a class, and you're going to give that class a nice semantic name. So in this example, let's say that our class that we're going to do is a card. So we're wanting to write a card. I see y'all have some questions about multiple style sheets and SAS and less, and I will talk about those. Yes, I think we've got time to talk about those. I could talk about those right after we get through BEM, I think. Yep, those are good questions. Anyway, so for block level elements, we want to give it a nice semantic name like card. Once we've got a nice semantic name, we're going to talk about any of the elements that make up a card inside of it. Any element that's inside of our block is delineated by 2 underscores, not 1, but 2. All right. And in this case, we might have a card that has a title, and a card has some content. So there might be 2 elements inside of that card. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about here, which is a little more optional, is a modifier. Modifiers take whatever the default state of your component is, or your block, and it changes it slightly to be a little bit different. So in this case, like, we might have an extra large card, or we might have a card title that normally is just like, black and white, but there's a danger version of it so that we can tell people about something going wrong. So we've modified that from its original state to a danger state. So if we were to write up an example of what that would look like in the HTML, here's what it would look like, or at least a possibility. So we have our top level block here of card. We have the element card title. We have an element of card content. And then on here, we also have a modifier to card title that's making it a light version. And there are some great benefits to what we're seeing here. Firstly, actually, let me see what we've got here. Yeah, here we go. So if we actually look at the CSS rendered, you can see that we've got a bit of a pattern here. We've got the block at the top, and then we have a single element, a single class element for each one of these, right? And we are using the cascade of just order to define and override styles, which means that we do not have to use specificity, which, as you remember, is a bit of a problem. So because we only have one class that is defined all the way down, and we are simply overriding those later, we don't have to worry about specificity. It's just one class all the way down. So that's kind of one great benefit of it. It keeps everything nice and semantic, and it keeps everything just being one level of specificity, which, as you recall, is great. Sorry. The other thing that it's going to be great at, well, I guess I just said this, is single level specificity, but it also gives you a very clear picture, both in the CSS and in the HTML, of what both are going to be doing, what they're going to look like. Anybody can look at that, and it reads like a story once you understand the basics of it. There's no confusion about it. It also is a very clear delineator for components. So that solves the problem of not knowing what you're going to break if you change something. Because anybody that uses that card component is going to be using it exactly the way that you expect it to be used. And if they're not, that's on them. Like, that's one of those things that, like, you have a lot of safety and certainty about it because it's that one component used for that one thing. There's no weird sharing of classes. It also keeps you from being locked into a specific element for styling. This kind of goes back to the question someone had about IDs, and it also is for elements. So like a great example is a button. A lot of people use anchor tags for button. A lot of people use buttons for buttons. There's even scenarios where you might want to use like a div or something like that for a button. But because we're only using classes and not elements, not IDs, we have a lot of flexibility for where we can apply all of these styles. This also scales marvelously. I've used this methodology for years. I've used it on little tiny sites like my personal site. I've used it for giant enterprise applications that have, 500-600 pages a piece. And it's always performed great. It's always been easy to maintain. I've had multiple times where the company's been like, oh, we need to rebrand everything. And we were able to do the entire rebrand with a couple hours of work on the one style sheet and send it out, and everything was rebranded because everything had been named semantically. Everything we had a lot of safety with because it was BIM. So it worked really well. Man, my little throat's killing me. All right. I think someone asked about preprocessors, specifically Sass. So let's talk about those real quick. Firstly, what is it? It's essentially a way to write CSS a little bit more like real code. CSS is very tedious to write by itself. There's tons of boring stuff that you have to remember about it. And preprocessors get you a lot closer to being able to do fancy things like doing for loops and writing variables and things like that. There are several popular preprocessors out there. These are the most popular ones. I would recommend that you use Sass if you need to use them, and I do think that they are worth using. Stylus is my favorite, but it's not very well supported just because of its syntax. It's a little bit prettier, it does a little bit more. And PostCSS technically is a post processor, and even if you don't use any preprocessors at all and just write CSS plain, I'd still recommend looking into PostCSS because it does some really cool things after your CSS is written that you might want to take advantage of, which we'll talk about in a second. So if you've not heard of preprocessors before, I'm going to show you what they can do. Firstly, just really simple things like being able to write variables and reuse them. In this case, we've got a border that we rewrote, so we can copy that and use it throughout with just referencing a variable like you're very accustomed to. It's not very strict about syntax. This kind of depends on the language you're writing in. I've got Stylus on here. I probably should have updated it to Sass, but it's no big deal. Same thing here, like you can nest selectors, which is powerful and wonderful. So in this case, you wouldn't have to have like this entire written out CSS class constantly. You could just nest it inside. And there are great ways to support BIM and still do this. Auto-prefixing is my favorite thing ever. This is one of the things I was talking about that you can do with post CSS that'll save you tons of time. This is a really simple post CSS thing you can run your CSS through. It'll add all of these stupid prefixes you have to like manually remember without you having to do it. You can just write the normal CSS and then tell Autoprefixer what you want to support, and it'll just add them for you. It's wonderful. There's also lots more you can do if you really get into it. Functions, looping, interpolation, inlining images, so you don't have to remotely get them. It's a lot. Also, don't forget to add source maps. This is going back to someone who was asking earlier about how you could tell where the CSS was coming from. If you do use a preprocessor, adding source maps in actually is a thing that most modern browsers can use to tell you where your source files are. So you don't have to locate them from post-processed CSS. Oh, someone just asked a really good question. I think I'm actually going to talk about that first because we've only got a few more minutes and my examples are less important than you guys. So someone asked, like many concepts, new ideas work well in a green pasture app. What's the best way to begin implementing these techniques when dealing with a 15-year-old app with Nightmare CSS already included? So this is a great question. The first thing I would do is you can go ahead and start using new CSS methodologies and using BIM, because almost certainly they're not doing that, right? I would strongly recommend adding a prefix to all of your CSS and all of the classes, so that makes it really clear what CSS is coming from your new stuff and what stuff is still old. And then you can start adding it in as you go. So this is something I've done a few times at previous companies. And what I mean by adding in a prefix, actually, I'll just pop this open. It might be easier to show. Here, we'll look at this ends example. So whenever you write a new class, so I'll inspect this test class. Instead of making the class named test, so the company I work for now, their name is Ease, E-A-Z-E. I might come up with a prefix like ease dash and call this ease test. And all of these would then be named ease test, of course, that there is no such thing as that now. But if all of your blocks start off with that prefix of ease or IR, some little like 2 or 3 little letter prefix, then you can start adding in that CSS and building onto it as you go and just moving stuff as you find that you have the time, because with those new methodologies that we are talking about here, we're not going to have the problem of it competing for any of the other old CSS, and you should be able to incrementally move it from there. Hopefully that makes sense. I should add something about that. That's a really good question. I think someone else asked about where we could find some of our CSS. This is a great question. So I was talking about creating source maps before. That's what we've got here. So this test was actually from a stylus file. I guess you can't see my mouse, but it is saying that index.stylus line 21 is where this, or 29 is where this is coming from. So you can actually go back and look at it. In our block model example, this was just HTML I slapped onto a page. So you can see it's telling you block HTML line 13 there. Let's see. Let's see what my next question is. CF document created. Table header, table body. That's hard. So for columns and rows that are generated in tables, tables are a little harder, but a lot of times I will just use the name of the table row. So if the column is containing username, I might call it username. It's not a great solution. And I will be honest, like tables are hard to style even when you're doing everything right. Just do the best you can. Like there's no CSS police coming for you. All right. I'm trying to look through and make sure I've got everyone's questions answered. Let's see, we've got the SAS one. Multiple style sheets versus one style sheet. So this is a great question. There's a lot of gray area here. I tend to lean towards liking one style sheet that has all of the vendor stuff if you have it. One style sheet that has main styles that are going to be used on the base of your site. And then if you've got any pages or sections that people don't go to very often, or it's less likely for them to go to them because it's like gated by a login or something, those might need to go in a separate sheet. But I mean, it varies. just like everything else. I know that's not a super great answer, but like browsers now are optimized for handling a lot of that. So having a lot of style sheets is not as big of a problem as it used to be. All right, so I think I've got most of the questions, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Let me make myself really small here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I actually opened this up to show. So firstly, these are just like basic selectors in action. So we can see like I've got a prefix on this one for my own sanity because it's coming from a different library I wrote, but CSS for responsive sites, a good question, but I've pulled it out of here because there's so much to talk about that I actually have an entire talk on just that. It's actually on my website, I think, if you're interested in going to look at it, which I will show here in just a moment. Right. So, for example, here I've got all of these test elements. Then I have an override here of test secondary. So you can see like, first I have my test, but then I decided for my secondary test, I wanted to have the background overridden. So I've done that here. It's only a single element override, right? The other cool thing to note, if you've never played with it before, I didn't get a ton of time to talk about it, but styling stuff with ims and rims is a great way to make your site a little bit more friendly for accessibility. So this is styled largely with ims. So if I go up to the base HTML and mess with the font size, you can see a lot of this site scales really nicely because I've scaled it based on ims, which is the font size of the base of the site. Don't have a ton of time to talk about that, but hopefully that's something you can Google. Let's see. How do you generate a source map? Okay, so if you're using any of the preprocessors, SES, LESS, SAS, Stylus, all three of those have got a source map generation. It's usually literally just saying source map true, and it adds it. So it's very quick and very easy, fortunately. And you wouldn't need source maps if you're not using any of those. They're really just for stuff where you have preprocessors. And you can quickly Google how to add those source maps in, and a lot of them do it by default. Just make sure you deploy those out, or you'll be source mapless and very sad. Let's see. What else do we want to talk about here? I think that might be, oh, I know. One more little thing we can talk about is hover states. So if you've ever cared about inspecting and changing states for like hover or whatever, you can click on this little HOV and it shows a drop down, and you can actually toggle on and off the hover state so you can inspect those. So if I turn hover on here and then close this, you can see that I've got like a special state on this. Now I can change this hover state as I would like, and it updates for all of them. So it's just kind of a cool little tip for those that don't know it's there. And I'll turn it back off. All right, let's, I think we're just about done here. So I can go back here and just go over a couple more things you might want to read about. This is the like take screenshots section. These are all methodologies that I did not have time to cover, including mobile first. And again, I'll show my website if you would like to go look at some of the like mobile stuff that is on here. It was just too much to cover in this session because there's a lot to talk about. And then here are some other fun things to Google that should help with your CSS progress. And that's it for me. If you've got questions, this is a great time to keep asking them. I'll try and make sure that I've answered all of them. You can find me on both Twitter and GitHub under Mr. Cinder. That's also where some of my other presentations are. I know I've got one on like the mobile first stuff. I had a presentation on converting desktop sites into mobile and some of the better ways to do that, how to tackle it. So those might be helpful as well. Let's see. Sometimes we get CSS files working fine, but the validator for CSS shows errors. Need to handle it or ignore it. Well, I'm always for handling errors. I don't know that there's like any penalties for not handling them, but that typically means that there's something going on with your site. Yeah, I always try and handle them as best I can. And if I can't, I at least write a note about why. I'm interested to know what the validator is saying, though. I'm going to scroll up and see if I've got any more questions here. Let's see. Okay, yep, just working. Hopefully I answered the question about why IDs are hard to use. I think that was everything. I see someone at the very top asked about media queries and using Bootstrap. I'm not a big fan of Bootstrap because it's not got a lot of great context for it. And I think that the media query stuff is like horrifically mismanaged. So I do tend to try and just write my own scaling for that stuff, but I understand like it's because I know how to do it really well. Hopefully for those of you that are curious, I'm happy to answer questions. Like you can send me a message on Twitter or something like that. I'll try and remember to answer if you have more interest in it. And maybe I'll put together some kind of presentation on that as well. So it sounds like there's some interest in that. Thank you all for coming and attending. And I think we've only got a couple more minutes, so keep bringing in those questions if you've got them. I'll wait around here. This presentation is also available on my GitHub, as well as like the examples are also in the same repo, so you can pull those down and mess with them if you would like. So that might be a good resource to just kind of play around and learn. So for code editing, I use VS Code, but you know, there's plenty of good ones out there. It is mrsender.com. I hope still. I hope Google hasn't done a weird on it. All right, thank you all for coming. It's been fun.